So all about navigating the ICF credentialing process. There's been a few changes, and we want to make sure that we're supporting everyone here with all of the latest information, including what those changes are and how you can be best prepared for going after your next credential. So it's exciting that we have Gary Patterson here, who's an MCC coach and ICF assessor. He will be talking us through some of the things that we should know, and I'll introduce him more formally in a few minutes. But before then, thought it would just be really helpful for us to, before we get into the nitty-gritty and some of the learning and some of the heavier things, just to get to know each other a little bit better if we haven't already. So what I will do is I will put us in breakout rooms just for about 10 minutes or so for folks to be able to just share a little bit about yourselves. I will actually drop in some prompts into the chat just around what made you show up here today? What do you believe it'll take for you to go to the next level in your coaching area? And what you think it means for you to be prepared to go after that next level. So I'll formally drop those into the chat. Renee, good to see you. Hello. All right, so let me go ahead and do that. And then I'll bring you all back, and then that's when we'll formally jump into the presentation. So it's just me on the back end, so bear with me as I do the admin Zoom things. It shouldn't be too hard. Okay. All right, here we go. Let me drop in the prompts. I hope it was a good time for you all to meet each other and just break the ice a little bit and just come and be in community. So that was the main purpose of that. And hopefully there are some thoughts that are moving and primed for this conversation. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started and introduce Gary. I'll let him do the majority of his own introduction, but for now, Gary is the Chief Visionary Officer, and he's a senior trainer at Organization Leadership Coaching. And that's where he supports clients in leader development, organizational strategy, and professional coaching. And he brings decades of leadership experience as a military officer and in many different sectors where he's been very inspirational and leading in the capacity of a coach. Gary holds an MCC designation from ICF, and I will pass it over to Gary to take it from here.
Well, first of all, I want to see if I can share my screen and see, is it connecting with everybody? Do you see that
Yes.
screen that's showing up okay? Good. I was answering Amy in our group when we got brought back about, what brought you to this topic? And so I'll try to cover that, Amy, a little bit more in my time together as I talk about this in terms of unfolding where we are with this. And so, Amy, I'll complete my explanation as I talk about this right now. So navigating ICF's credentialing transition, and the key word in that to me is transition. We are in a transition. And I was sharing with the group earlier that transition was on warp speed from 2020. And so a lot of things are changing, have been changing, And the ICF that most are engaging right now, while the philosophical backdrop is not different, the process is different. And so we want to kind of benchmark where we kind of been, where we are, where we're going. And in order to do that, I kind of play in the sandbox. I was telling Bruce that out at Katie, Spike Lee also always says this is another Spike Lee joint, Zachary. And I felt like I said, well, this is another sandbox production. That's what Gary Charles does, in terms of Amy, what we're doing. This is a production of me throwing sand up in the air and letting it fall down in whatever organizational thing that it is. And that's kind of how I see myself moving these days in terms of the creativeness and what I'm doing in the world in this space. Here are some sandbox creations that we've already developed. These are a couple of books. One of them is the primer book, and it's the first course in organizational leadership coaching where we train coaches to be able to learn the skill of coaching. And by the time I finished that at about 2020, 2021 and put that on the market, then the ICF, the core competencies were being revised. And so that caught me in that transition as well. And then the PCC markers came about, and that further put me in a tailspin as well, because now we've got new competencies and the PCC markers. And Amy, that kind of talks about that transition, because those of us who've been around for a while the PCC markers were there, they really weren't as front row and center coming through as they are right now. And so you'll see in the competent coach that I began to bring the PCC markers into that work. So we got a lot of sand in there in that work that we were able to do. And then there were some more changes, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And so as those changes go about, so some of you are looking at this right now. My AI, I asked my bot, I want a picture of an old guy with hair going everywhere with jeans on, with tennis shoes, with his shirt out. That's kind of where I am these days, of just throwing sand up in the air, Leslie, and I'm just doing cray stuff. It doesn't really matter to me. I'm not formal. I'm just having a good time in all of the stuff that I do. So if I act a little bit weird today, Bruce has already given, he kind of controls me out there in Katie, and don't blame Zach. Zach knew I was going to act a little bit like this, but I determined I was going to have fun with this while we do this. And so I didn't come to be bored. I came to have fun and throw sand up in the air, and let's see where it lands and how it lands. So I hope that you can enjoy it. We're in Texas right now, and don't worry about it. I'm not going to preach at you just because I got this preacher on the screen, but I want to share with you a little bit of Black history of preachers in Texas. This guy, Caesar Clark, was about 5'5", and he was one of the best preachers ever in America. If you ask Dr. Martin Luther King, who would he like to preach? He'd say Gardner Taylor, and I'm sure he would say Caesar Clark. And Caesar Clark stood about 5 feet, and he always wore a black suit and a real thin tie, and he'd go to the podium and he'd talk real slow like black preachers do, that kind of thing. But Zachary, he had one famous sermon at the National Baptist Convention near the end of his life, and the sermon was, after 50 years, what shall I preach? And what he did, Zachary, is he went over 50 years of being in that convention and all the preaching and boiled it down to a nutshell of a basic message he wanted to teach. And so, Amy, him being outdone, I can't do him, but I'm asking us the question, after 30 years of the ICF, Zach, what shall we be? What shall we be? Amy, what I'm saying is, we're coming up on 30 years. How do we step into who-ness of who we are? And where are we? And who are we when we step into that space? I was telling Bruce, did you see my little note down there? This is Gert's boy on the left. Is Bruce there?
Yes, I saw it.
I just want to make sure you saw that haircut. I used to have a haircut, so don't think I always walk this mile. This picture, they have it up as part of the 23 convention, but actually this was in Washington, D.C. a number of years ago, and they still have it as though it was the 23 convention, but it wasn't. But in any case, the point that we're doing is that after 30 years, and I want to kind of be nostalgic here for just a minute and talk about coaching in the context of its development in history, Renee. You see what I mean? It's where did we come from? Where are we at? And where are we going is what I want to try to talk about. So in the advertisements, Zach put out that we were going to talk about these three main things, and I added something at the end, something I want to talk about, a recommendation for those of us who are going forward. And so I want to talk about that in addition to that. And I want to spend most of my time right here in the middle, emergence of the PCC markers. And here's why, Amy. My understanding of the PCC markers is kind of nebulous, to say the least, but they have become front row and center. And in these performance evaluations that we have to pass in, or that you have to pass in, thank God I don't have to pass in anymore for the rest of my life. Renee, I'm gonna start shouting here. Don't let me get excited here that I don't have to do no more, Zach. I don't have to do no more passing in of anything. Thankful about that. But it was interesting to have to walk through that and talk about the PCC markers and how they show up inside of the coaching process as we go along. So I want to major on that to show what's going on behind curtain number 3 in that evaluation process. Somebody said this, I read today, I was trying to find this idea about the context of servant leadership. And Anne McGee Cooper said these words. I just happened to find this on the internet today. The true heroes of the new millennium will be servant leaders who quietly are working out of the spotlight to transform our world. Wow. You know, I say that if you are a coach and you need to be in the spotlight, you need to go find you another business. Because in large part, we operate behind the scenes, moving people, organizations, agendas, dreams and visions and aspirations. That's kind of our work behind the scenes. And I would contend that if those of us who are coaches, if we don't have a passion to do that, then coaching may not be a best fit for us. But in a sense, I really think it's important that we see ourselves in the midst of history, behind the scenes to some way, not so much in the spotlight, but key there is transforming the world. And when I say transforming the world, you know, I don't mean to preach here, okay? So I'm not going to preach here, even though I am a preacher, but that's not my point about preaching. But it's the passion of saying that we're showing up in the space of organizations and in the world with people and making an impact that actually does change the world. In this is the ICF that we were in Washington, D.C. And this is the cadre of people that meet every 2 years now, I think we do, that we disperse to 141 countries around the world to do the work that we do. And to sit or stand in the midst of this group, this body of people that come from all over the world with the common agenda of coaching and methodology, both ontologically and in terms of the gestalt of coaching, to come together to do this. And I put up on top Greenleaf's Servant Leader. Greenleaf wrote that paper, The Servant Leader, maybe in 1970. And at the risk of not taking too much long with this, that paper set pretty much almost 35, almost 40 years up on a shelf before he brought it out when the bottom fell out of America in terms of the context of the stock market during the Bush administration of 2008. And what they found is the leadership across the board in America, our CEOs all the way down through the leadership apparatuses of those companies, that it was because of the greed of that mindset of that period of time that caused the debacle that we suffered in that period. And so the antidote that people grab for historically, as I put this together, throwing sand up in the air, is that Greenleaf's little paper was dusted off, and the mantra of servant leadership was the antidote almost put into the chasm of the woundedness of our organizations, our institutions, and the greed and the motives that were involved in that as the antidote. And Greenleaf postulated, he said, I would see that every organization would have a servant leader at the top. What an aspiration that is. The reason I introduced this is that my concept in this sand that I'm throwing up right now has this thought, that servant leaders are what we need in organizations and in our society to civilize it across the board. But the question is, who are the civilizers? And y'all watch my grammar here. I kind of play with grammar sometimes. I'm not intending to be all polished. But who civilizes our society? And what I want to say is that I believe that one of the instruments on planet Earth in terms of helping societies across all the organizations is coaching. We civilize society probably as well or better than any other organization on the planet, is my view. Now, I'm biased toward the church. I think, and Greenleaf actually said that the seminaries who are positioned to do this, they defaulted and have not taken up the mantra. And so sometimes our religious organizations who could do this as well may not be focused on this as much as they could be. So he wasn't all that critical, but he does mention that in the paper of what they could do. So that leaves a space. And so when I talk about where are we and who are we right now ontologically, and how do we step in our gestalt into our being, then the question is, how do we show up in that space? And when we look back at our background, the history, I put in Vicky Brock's book here. If you don't have a copy of that, please get it. You can also get her dissertation. It's still floating around freely, where she transitioned her book from a dissertation into the book that you see on the left. But she writes perhaps the best treatise of the history of coaching, coming all the way back for the last 30 years, but it's tributaries that also come into coaching. She traces better than anybody that I know organizationally. But the people that you see on the screen also influenced, and most of us go back to Thomas Leonard. Thomas Leonard really was great at the process of putting together the process at Coach U and the ICF back in those early days, 30 years ago when the ICF was being birthed in 93 and coming out. The process was really back to Thomas Leonard and the group that came out of California in that way. The other person that quietly is there, that's in the vaccine that I often want to champion is Laura Whitworth of CTI. Some of you have graduated from CTI. You know her work well because that's the body that produced that whole school. But she provided the heart for coaching. While Thomas provided the process, he was a genius at putting together process. Laura provided the heart that we bring to the passion of coaching in that way. And then Tim Galloway, and there are others that are out there, he talked about the process. How do we coach the who of people? How do we coach the inside? It's not so much that you hit the ball. What are you thinking when you start to hit the ball? What messages are you saying and telling yourself? And you and I as coaches are trying to get into that message because that's where we impact the who as we do our coaching. And so Tim Collins, I called that the conscious. I made these up, heart, process, conscious. And then Whitmore brings in engaging the business world and taking it into organizations and putting it that way. And so we look at these historical roots. And if you want to picture it, here's what it looks like in a picture. Now I give royalty to Royal Rose University, not to the university. I think this is the property of Carolyn Conlon up in Canada. I believe this belongs to her. In other words, I was hanging out with them up there, and I came back with this, so I attribute it to Carolyn. And I think it's hers because this is her coaching model. I see, I will, I can in the center. That's why I'm really attributing it to her specifically. But for those of you who are coming into coaching, this is a picture of the tributaries, I call it, that come in to make up what we do. All of the component parts. Now, Brock will give you all the technicalities that you want about how all that happened, what would happen if you want to get down in the woods with all of that. But this picture gives you a 30,000-foot view of how it came together from the tributaries so that we end up doing the kind of work that we do and how we find ourselves operating in the world in that way. You know, he talks about the strategies of these folks. There's some folks that we named here a few minutes ago, some of the excellent strategies, some of these root things that go into it, behavioral sciences, and then Socrates, spiritual traditions, human potential movements, the business and economics, they call that coaching foundations. And then what are these theories that come out? And we're just not coming back to lean heavily on systems theory. It's always been there, but now it's being more prominently integrated as we begin to take systems as the coachee is involved in a system in which they're being coached and they fit within an organization system. And how do we do that? So we're pulling out and moving into another phase about this, but you can see those theories that go in, and then the personal attributes that we bring to coaching. You know, you can talk about these, and then up here, some of the people that I just named a little bit ago and some of the competencies that go into this. What I think this is an excellent picture for us to see where the history of what we do and how it has come together to talk about what we do. So let me manage my time just for a second. Zach, how much time do I have left?
Yep. So you have about 50 minutes left.
All right, good deal. Good deal. I'm off to the run. All right. So the question is, where are we now is what I'm looking at right now. So all of those tributaries that come up to this picture painted of how we got to where we are right now, so that all that you're studying and all of the competencies and all of the markers that you're looking at and all of that came together into this unique discipline of coaching is the combination of all of those tributaries that came in to make that what it is. I call that, here is where we are right now, okay? And now the question is, as we look at where we are right now, you know, what does that net us? What does that benefit us? Where does that place us in terms of our movement? In the chat box, somebody tell me, anybody know who this guy is? And somebody read the chat box. Zach, if you could just pay attention to the chat box. Anybody know this face? Is there any answer in that chat box?
No answer so far.
All righty. Well, for the sake of time, I'm going to give it to you so we can move on. This guy took a walk every Sunday morning with Steve Jobs. And the question is, why would Steve Jobs hang out with this guy? He's not a relative, he's not a best friend or anything like that. But he took a walk with Steve Jobs for a long period of his life. And if you go back to Steve Jobs, to his eulogy, when he died, Steve Jobs was there eulogizing him at his funeral because of their relationship. But the bottom line is, this was Steve Jobs' coach. So when we look at where we are right now, coaching has been able to infiltrate our organizations and come into mainstream of everything that we're doing right now and find its prominent place in a place that is wonderful for us as a foundation. And I hold him up because they just wrote a book about him called The $1 Trillion Coach. Why would they call him the $1 trillion coach? And there's the book that you see it. It's because this guy, Bill Campbell, not so much in the coaching genre that we operate in terms of our competencies, in terms of our markers and all that. That wasn't uniquely the style of coaching that he was doing. So granted, I don't want you to believe that that's the case. However, Bill was not concerned about the content that they were managing to produce the things that they produce. He was a manager of their relationships with each other and within the organization. Therefore, he was a coach to do very much of what we do in that way, just not with the same methodology according to the guidelines that we're being offered by the ICF. It's a bit different. But here is what he did. He walked alongside Steve Jobs as Apple and some others we're going to see in just a few minutes that he also coached at the same time, that these organizations made not just millions, not just billions, but these were $1 trillion organizations that will be being managed by people. And these $1 trillion managers and owners, they were predominantly being coached by this guy. That's interesting. I'm going to play a couple of videos that you've all probably heard before or seen before. And if you haven't seen them before, well, you're blessed today to just think about what does this mean and what does this say and how does this position us as coaching inside of America, inside of industry, not just inside with people and moving them through an aspirational movement and goal of where they're going. That process sits on its own bottom. But how do we show up in the space of the world and organizations and how we position to do our work at a larger aspirational way? So I'm a dreamer in that way. So I throw up sand everywhere to see where it's going to land down. And so let's listen for a minute, and I'm going to burn up some good chunk of time showing these. But think about what this does for coaching and the mindset of coaching.
Everyone needs a coach. It doesn't matter whether you're a basketball player, a tennis player, a gymnast, or a bridge player. My bridge coach, Sharon Osberg, says there are more pictures of the back of her head than anyone else's in the world. Sorry, Sharon. Here you go. We all need people who will give us feedback. That's how we improve.
Over the years, I've received so many different kinds of advice, I don't know where to start. One that comes to mind is to have a coach. Our board member in 2002, John Doerr, said, "You need a coach." And I said, "Well, I don't need a coach. I'm an established CEO. Why would I need a coach? Is something wrong?" He said, No, you need a coach. Everybody needs a coach. So Bill Campbell became my coach and has served Google very well. Every famous athlete, every famous performer has somebody who's a coach. Somebody who can watch what they're doing and say, is that what you really meant? Did you really do that? They can give them perspective. The one thing people are never good at is seeing themselves as others see them. A coach really, really helps.
In this next video, I want you to listen very critically to what's being said and how they're talking about Bill Campbell. It's Eric Schwartz again with the group that's there, but listen to the widespread influence that not only Bill Campbell has, but the whole genre of coaching and how it's being positioned as they talk about this right now. And then I'll meet you on the other side.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are so privileged today. Today we're going to talk about the culture of coaching. We're going to talk a little bit about Bill Campbell, we're going to talk a little about Google, we're going to talk a lot about coaching, we're going to talk a lot about leadership. And we've got no one better than the authors of the fabulous book that you have in your bags, The $1 Trillion Coach. Alan Eagle, Jonathan Rosenberg, Eric Schmidt. Please join me in giving them a really warm welcome.
Liverpool, Manchester City. Which ones are you? Do they have coaches? Are their coaches incredibly famous? British people have coaches too.
Our football teams do.
Well, why not your businesses? The moment I met Bill, I knew my world would be better.
Bill was born in Western Pennsylvania, went to college in New York. He was a football coach, American football, and not particularly good, by the way, because they'd lost so many games, he decided he's not going to be a good coach. Goes into business, rises through the ranks pretty quickly at Kodak, and then in 1983 gets hired by John Scully to come west to work for Apple and oversee the launch of the Macintosh. And worked at Apple for several years, rose through the ranks, was a senior executive there, ended up becoming CEO of Intuit, and then didn't go into coaching until the late 90s. So he really had three phases to his career: football coach, business executive, business coach.
But I said, do we pay you? And he said, no. Do you want stock options? And he goes, no. Do you want to be on the board? And he goes, no, it'll get in the way of what I want to do. And all of a sudden I understood I was dealing with something very different from anything I'd encountered before. This is a person who's a saint in the business world. They're working without compensation, and their goal was to make us, and in particular me, successful.
Bill didn't just coach people at Google, he coached right across Silicon Valley. How does it feel knowing that he's coaching you, your competitors?
He really didn't coach us with respect to the strategy and the tactics and the product functionality. He coached us as a team. He coached us to be better leaders. He coached us to build trust with our people. And because he wasn't weighing in on the strategy and tactics, it worked for him to coach people at competitors.
And it's remarkable in hindsight, but not only was he intimately involved with Steve Jobs and the management of Apple, but he was also incredibly involved with everything going on at Google, to the point where he engineered my placement onto the Apple board. Until we started writing this book, I never figured out that he was coaching the whole team. I thought he was coaching me. I was aware he was coaching others. But in fact, now when we went back, especially Alan with all of his research, we saw the technique. When anyone on the team started doing their own thing, they kind of stopped playing, they started playing for themselves as opposed to for the team. He would either gently or bluntly get them back in. And furthermore, when Apple and Google, in particular Steve Jobs and Google, had huge conflicts, he would then coach both sides to calm down and talk to each other.
Bill was not looking to coach people who weren't already on the verge of being strong or great. He was looking to coach superstars that he could make better.
Around Bill Campbell, people felt it was an honor to be coached by him.
The way I would do it with you is I'd say, you're the best interviewer in the world. And then next week, when you made some mistake, I'd say, you could have done that better. Notice what I did is I praised you, just set a high expectation.
Very good.
And then I pointed out that you fell short to your own aspirations.
And I would want to own that.
And now you are going to lift
Very
yourself,
good.
as opposed to me saying, what a terrible thing you did, which completely cuts you down. That's coaching. I've always thought that the most important thing to do was work on strategy, tactics, specific products and technology, and I'm sort of very efficient on that. But in fact, if you look, it's really teams that deliver this. Who invented the iPhone? Everybody in this room thinks Steve Jobs. No, it's 1,000 people. There's something wrong when the coaching is the lowest priority. The coaching is the highest priority, right? Because getting the humans right determine the outcome.
When you see that in a company, when you see someone whose passion and excitement is palpable for another person's success as a manager, that tells you a lot.
Bill and I talked a lot about this principle. You have to go from I to we. You have to go from yourself to the team. The team has to be making the decisions. You need to be supervising it. The sooner you can make that, the sooner you can scale.
Now, is this not an advertisement for us, a great wide open door for us as coaches? And how in 30 years, coaching has been positioned, not so much like exactly what Bill is doing in that way, But nevertheless, the platform and the door that's been opened for us that we can capitalize on is how can we show up in that space and capitalize on what's already going on in the space of coaching. And I just wanted to hold that up. And as we look at the stats that you see before you, we've got 56,000 coaches around the world. We've got 141 chapters that are going on. And you can see the numbers of the 56,000, how many ACCs, how many PCCs, and how many MCCs. And this cadre of people of energy and talent and skill with passion that's being released on the world and growing every day. That's the work that we do. That's where we are right now. And that's the opportunity we have to all of us come together. Amy, you were talking about what gives you passion. I'm part of this to bring this passion together because I'm sitting 20 years in those meetings and I'm just listening. But I'm part of the cadre to make this movement, to make it happen. So coming alongside coaches in this matriculation of the ACC and the PCC and the MCC is my passion. And then soon, the team coaching. If you didn't get that advertisement for team coaching and you missed it, you might want to go back and look at that video again and say, does this not open a great wide open door for the team coaching apparatus and that whole new skill for team coaching that's just across the horizon or part of the horizon right now that we're going to be moving into to impact organizations, and I'm going to recommend some things in a little while. But as you look at the screen right now, this is the change, the transition. These certifications have not changed. They look different. There's one that has been added, the team coaching certification that is now, and we're trying to throw sand up in the air right now and generate one for our company to be able to do that. I'm in supervision training right now to become a supervisor so that I can certify the team coaching apparatus. But down at the bottom, all of these schools had to be redone. They closed down all of the what they call ACSTH. I'll talk about these acronyms in a few minutes, and all these ACTPs to get rid of those acronyms to simplify to be level 1 school, level 2, level 3. I talked about transition. All of these schools that used to be approved coach specific training hours, which would be L1, and the accredited coach training programs, which were L2, all of them had to be shut down. Now, those of you who went to one of those, you can still use those credits in portfolio to be certified, so don't worry about that. But future students cannot attend these. They don't exist anymore. That's a huge transition. And I'm going to talk about what that means in just a few minutes, talking about the transition. On the screen, you can see what the requirements are. Most of you know that. If you're going to the next level, you pretty well know where you are. So I won't spend a lot of time talking about what you need in order to do that. That's not my purpose here. You can read that on the internet yourself. What I'm trying to position is the ICF making this huge transition. Well, not only did the process change, all of the schools had to shut down, recertify to come back up to L1, L2, and L3. And that was a huge undertaking by everybody who had to go through it. Amy, I think you were talking about walking alongside some education processes who had to go through that kind of thing. And so it was huge. We're talking about transition when we look at that. You can see that transition again in a different way on that slide, and I won't take time there. Now, along with that, I was looking at Carly Anderson's website. And the reason I went to Carly is because Carly was involved physically at the ICF in the conversion of the competencies, and she was involved with the PCC Markers. And so she makes a couple of statements that transition-wise we can benchmark. One is that the competencies hadn't really been changed for 25 years. So they were really there from the beginning almost. This recent change within the last 2 years of those competencies is a major transition. And then she talked about the 47 indicators that we now call the PCC markers and how they are integrated into this process in a more subtle kind of way. And I want to spend a good chunk of time just talking about that piece of the PCC markers. But she talked about these two things, the markers and the PCC, the core competencies have shifted and changed. And then right when we get all of that done, I hate to let you know, boys and girls, but here's the issue. The code of ethics has just been changed as of 1 April. Somebody needs to say amen, but I won't take you to church around that. But the point that we're making is that we are in transition. As you look at this chart, you can see how the 11 competencies were collapsed into the 8. So you can kind of see what happened on the right, those 11 that many of us were around, and we cut our teeth in training on that 11, but they're moved over into the 8, and you can see how they come out. So I'll let you scan that for just a second. Okay. Secondly, here is what it looks like in terms of how they collapsed into the 8. Now, most of you did not have the experience on the left, so that won't be part of your history. It was all done. If you're 2 years in, maybe 3 years in, then that's not the 11 on the left-hand side was not part of your history. But for those of us who cut our teeth on the left, you can see the transition of what's happening with the competencies. So that's pretty clear. That transition is pretty clear. And I think that it's pretty simple for us to reformat our minds in terms of having a coaching mindset and a growth mindset to shift to get why we made this shift in the competencies. It's just logical. It's not a big movement. There's another big movement along the way. What's really holy moly are the markers. If somebody could say to me in the chat box, when were the markers, it was up above if you were paying attention to it, when were the markers created? Anybody putting anything in the chat box?
2014 is one guess from Amy.
All right, Amy, good job, Amy, because that is exactly when it happened. Now, if the thing that I want to say about that, Amy, is that if the markers have been around since 2014, where were they? Now, the reason I ask that question is that most of us who went through training schools during that period of time, the markers were actually there. And I think in some ways we were being evaluated by them, but we didn't know it, really. The markers, in my experience, didn't come into prominence until about 2020, 2022, right in there. And then they started being front row and center. And then there's 47 of them. Holy moly is why I put that there. You know, how do you organize all of that? And Bruce was asking me about that out in the Katy. So he said, Gary, how do we handle all this? And I told Bruce, no problem. We got this. We can help them with this. And so we made up something. He said, you can look at all of this change that's coming about through the EMATS plague that's coming about. Now, we'll talk about this in just a few minutes. We made up these acronyms to try to get a handle on the component parts of this transition. Now, you can make up your own acronyms, and we're advocating that you do something to try to organize it in your mind, because a lot of this data, a lot of this information, a lot of these competencies, a lot of these PCC markers, a lot of this information, there's a volume to it. There's a lot of stuff going in it. The question is, how do you organize it so that you can consistently think your way through it, particularly as you go through the examinations, the credentialing examination. And so what we did was, looking at this little statement, and I did some antics up at the meeting to say there's a plaque coming, and it's called the EMATS plague. But the bottom line we were trying to say is, here are the core values under CHIP. And so you chip away using a chip to chip, and then that's professionalism, collaboration, humanity, and equity. Those have not changed even in the new code of ethics that I have not talked about yet. because there's a whole effective 1 April, there's a new set of code of ethics. In addition to these other two bodies of material that we're talking about right now. These are the older ethic statements. There were 28 of them as you go across, and that's pretty complicated as they start running all over the place and trying to keep tabs on them. And the basis of those statements, if you took the coach credentialing examination prior to 1 April, then you were being evaluated on these. I'm sure that the new evaluation for ACC has been upgraded, and the new one for PCC will be upgraded as well, effective 1 April of 2025. That's just a few days ago. So that transition is beginning to infiltrate into the evaluations that you will take. For those of you going to PCC, you'll have to take it. Going to MCC, you'll have to take something in that way. And so that learning is up above. And I'll come back to the ethics in just a few minutes. Here are the new ethics. You can scan these. I won't say much about them. I just pulled them out so that you could just scan. Here is where we're going with the new code of ethics as of 1 April 25. I don't want to major on these. I point these out because it would be helpful for you to go to the website of the ICF, pull down the code of ethics, number one, and get a new copy, a fresh copy. And then they have another scale that shows you the differences between the old one and the new one. Draw that down as well. And if you want to see the shifting and the transition in the actual statements, and you care about that kind of analysis, there are two documents that are out there that I would advocate that you can go to and look at. But I think all of us would do well to draw down a fresh copy of the new ethics, a code of ethics, and start memorizing them, because the next time you take a credentialing exam, they will be front row and center almost in everything that you do on that exam. So that's just a word to the wise of advice. I said that the values did not change much on the new code of ethics. You can see them on the right-hand side. They basically kind of stayed the same, but you can see the differences as they go by. So I just wanted to flash up there for you the code of ethics to first of all let you know there is a new and improved code of ethics out there that are going along with the transition of all these other two entities, namely the core competencies and the PCC markers. So all of this is changing within the last 2 years. And that's why, Amy, I talked about why would I talk about this, is to try to give us all a big picture of what these transitions are about, because they really stayed pretty stable for almost 25 or 30 years. This is a particular period of time in the ICF for this movement to shoot us into the future. So if you look at the standards, you can see the 5 major areas that are there, and you can go online and see how the statements are. They still have those numbers, but the numbers in the new ethics are much like 3-1, 3-2, 3-3, 4-1, 4-2. They go along with them, and so they're numbering these much differently than they did, but much more like the PCC markers, and you'll see that reflected when you draw it down. So that's really all I want to say about the ethics. But the question is, how do you organize all of this into a shot group or a picture from the 30,000-foot view? And if you'd give me about 5 or 10 minutes to give you some sand that we throw up in organizational leadership coaching on how we're trying to help our students to picture this, I want to give you some backdrop of what we formulated as we threw sand up, and this becomes another sandbox production product of what we do. So this picture is what we call the PCC marker flight plan model. But we made this up from scratch and throwing sand up to try to say, how can we capture the majority of everything we've learned, put it in one picture, in one shot group that talks about the whole process, okay? So I'm going to go from top to bottom to show you what we mean. I won't go into a definition of everything, but I'll orient you to the chart so you can place in your learning, because it's not different than what you already know. If you went to a PCC school or an ACC, a level 1 school or level 2 school, or even back before that, if you went to ACTP school or one of the other ones. You learned all of this. We're just kind of putting it in a way where you could see it in one shot group. And so our model of coaching is the first thing that we did is we put that model across the top. That's the model we teach in OLC. And I'm not trying to teach you that model just to talk about it. And then when you get to the next course, we expand that model a little bit more because we want to shift from coaching what issues to coaching who issues. And so there's a shift between what we call the primer course for us and the competent course for us. And we talk about the shifting of the learning layers as we're laying it out. And that's what's portrayed in these two models. So the second group on the second line builds on the first one. And so the first one stays in place, but it expands to a little deeper way where we really start looking at the who. We start exploring the issues more deeply. How can we sustain the structure so when they leave the coaching session that there's stability to be sustained in whatever they've gained in the session? So how do you do that? And so that's what we mean by putting these issues out at the end. Then we say, come up with the focus. And where are you going? We call this, it's like a flight, getting on a plane. Where are you going? First thing you want to do is choose your destination and where you want to go. The beginning of the session starts here. Where are you going? The middle passage is where you're flying up there. And when you're flying, you're developing your strategy and coming out with a plan to produce before you start getting ready to land. We call that generation. Figure out your destination. What's your generation? What's the application when you get off? So when you start landing the plane, what did you learn? How can you capitalize, bring it all together? What kind of accountability would you want to set up for yourself before you land? And then we step into the new destination. So we put that in words: boarding the plane, taking off, flying, landing, deplaning. Okay, so that's pretty clear about what we're doing there. Now, these tools, Bruce was saying the other day that these tools that are there, and what we're doing in these tools is, and I think in my next slide, I have some other things, empathetic alignment. And that has to do with some work done by Marion Franklin when she talks about empathetic alignment. And then Marsha Reynolds comes back talking about coaching the who, coach the person, not the problem. And so a lot of these tools are things like that you're implementing along the way while you're doing this coaching up there. We want them to learn these tools, to utilize them. And those tools really point out to be PCC markers all the way across the board. They really are stepping into those. And then I try to suggest how to manage your time across a coaching session and what you're doing in there, and then the markers down at the bottom. Now, this is what we teach on the ACC, focusing on getting started and finishing. When they go to the next course, then we're trying to fill it all in where they're moving toward these same things, but we're asking them to be more about using these tools that we're calling them in the center. And now you have a full array of the PCC markers, full array of the PCC markers. These markers are what in your performance evaluation, for those of us who are approved to be evaluators of your performance, of your coaching performance, it is these markers that we're watching as you go along. That's what's determining whether you're being referred for that credential or not preferred for that credential. That's what's going on behind the scene. And historically, while these have always been there, as we just talked about the date that they were done, they're coming into vogue right now, being emphasized even more and more and more and more. That's why I'm having this conversation with you. This chart, if you would put in the chat box to say to them, Steve, would you please send me a copy of Gary's slides? We'll send it to you in a PDF, and we'll send you a large copy of this if this would be useful for you, and any other ones that you'll have. We're more than willing to share these with you, so you can do that. But so it suffices to say here that these markers from 3.1 through 3.4, all the way from 8.1 to 8.9, that as you're flying this plane, you could conceptually say, get off the ground with this one, land it over here, and then do the work of coaching in the middle. And I'm suggesting that we put those markers in that way. So when you see this, of course, there's a lot more to each one of those markers in terms of verbiage, but I kind of shortened them all down to the essence of what that marker is about. And that may be helpful just to prompt you. When I coach, I have a poster of this up on the board where I have all of these markers before me when I coach, so that I can see this whole thing in a larger presentation of it. And particularly when you're coaching in your exercise where you're doing your performance evaluation, I've got this in front of me to grade that performance, because that's exactly what we're looking for. Are these things being done? Okay. Now I'm going to try to save some time at the end. We can come back to this and you can ask more questions. But key into these asterisks that we have down here, because these asterisks, they show us that those particular markers have to be done more than one time across the coaching endeavor. If you did it once, you don't get credit for the marker unless you did it twice. Because we're evaluating your skill at implementing the marker, not just that you did the marker. That's a big mouthful, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And so I'll leave this right here, and we can come back to it if we have some more time. We're going to be in the Katie cohort that we're doing right now. We're going to talk about this more as Bruce, maybe toward the end of the year, we'll talk more about this methodologically. So what is it that the assessors are looking for and at when they're evaluating the markers? And I want to spend a few minutes really giving you what's going on behind doing number 3. So when you're being evaluated for those markers, and all of them, all 47 of them across there, okay? And you don't have to do them all in every session, and so that's going to be a big question that some ask, sometimes no, you don't have to do them all, but you have to do enough. You do enough, particularly those 1 and 8 in your ACC, you're going to have to do more in PCC, and you're going to be functioning on all cylinders by the time you get to MCC. So the standard just gets higher as you go up in terms of the implementation and the mastery of those markers as you go along with the competencies. So there's this. But if you want to look, I'm going to give you a brief snapshot of what we're looking for, or what the ICF has us looking for as we grade you. Now, having said that, let me make this statement about the L1, L2, and L3, the difference in those schools. The difference in those L1, L2, and L3 schools is that your performance evaluation is done internally to the school. So when you get your certificate from the school, they have already said whether you're coaching at the ACC, the PCC, or the MCC level, depending upon whether it's L1, L2, or L3. And that there are a group of people, or 1 or 2 people at your school, who have had to qualify to be an assessor. They had to be trained, certified to be an assessor in order to do that on behalf of the school. The big change in these schools, additionally of bringing on the PCC markers in a heavy way that has been done, is that the evaluations are done internally. So the question is, what's the measurement by which they're evaluating? I'm glad you asked me. You can see it on the screen. A marker should be evaluated based on the coach's responsiveness to what the client brings in the conversation. So if we're looking at somebody coaching and the coach is kind of rigidly not really with the client, then what we're evaluating is how are they able to do the dance with the client. The principal emphasis that the coach is not merely performing a pre-planned skill. In other words, is this person using this skill to punch the ticket for the marker but it's not really locked to what's going on in the session. That's a huge one. That's what this is about. When he says performing a pre-planned skill, but is actively engaging with the unique and unfolding reality of the client in that moment. So that's the contrast. Are they just punching the ticket to do the marker? Or does it fit the reality of the flow of the conversation and it meets a particular need in the flow? So that's the evaluation. You get credit for it if you are doing that. You could be contradistinctive. You could get contra-measures. You could get something that takes away from your coaching if the evaluator discerns that that's what you're doing across the session. So that's number one in terms of evaluation. Number two, demonstration of skill and application at the PCC level. And I highlighted this. They must be able to demonstrate the marker through behavior that reflects the minimum expected proficiency, not the maximum and not the minimum. So if they just get in by the skin of their chinny chin chin, then the determination is to try to give them credit for that. That's what we as assessors have been told. We're not trying to not score you well. It's the opposite. We're trying to get you into the PCC level, into the ACC level, into the MCC level at the bottom level. That's the goal of what this marker is about. That's number two. Okay, so the motive is there. Then the other one has to do with clarity of evidence in the session. It has to be clearly demonstrated that the person actually did that marker. And we have to put a time stamp as to when it happened in the session. That's why you have to pass in a transcript with time stamps with everybody. That's why that's so necessary, because the evaluator must be able to observe a clear and distinct moment in the coaching conversation that aligns with that marker to give credit. Every once in a while at the school, at the ICF, they will evaluate a school as to whether the school is doing a good job evaluating. We have to put several of them in every year. We get evaluated on whether we're evaluating properly. And those markers being properly evidenced and marked is part of our evaluation in the school. And so that's what we're looking at in that way as we go along. I'm going to hurry because I want to leave some time for conversation. The fourth issue is emphasis on positive evidence over contradictory evidence. So in other words, what I was saying a few minutes ago is we're trying to major on what's positive the best we can for the coach. That's coaching. And those negative issues, we're not trying to focus on them. But if they come up and they override the session, we have to acknowledge it in that way. So while it's important to notice when a coach does something that may detract from effective coaching, the marking of most PCC markers should focus primarily on the presence of the positive, that is observable evidence, rather than the absence and the mistakes. That's kind of merciful and generous, on behalf of the ICF, but the message to those of us who evaluate, that's what we're being given. The bottom said, evaluators are encouraged to weigh the evidence with generosity and discernment, focusing on what the coach did well and how that aligns with the spirit and letter of the marker. Okay, so those are the four standards by which you're being evaluated by. And we talk about what would be helpful to talk about this. I kind of took these and chewed them up from the ICF and spit them back out in a practical way that I think is helpful for those of you as you prepare for the evaluation. I'll try to save some time. So the last thing I want to treat before we get to some time for questions is where are we going now? Okay, we talked about where we've been. I just talked about where we are in this big transition, schools and competencies and the PCC markers and all of that. Okay, where are we going? And I say this as I'm throwing sand up in the sky, that in this VUCA flat world of AI, now, if you have to ask the question, what is VUCA, what is flat world, and what is AI all put together, if you can't interpret that sentence, then I would ask you to go to AI and ask the question, what is it? What is the VUCA flat world of AI? And it'll give you this answer. Here is the environment that I think we are doing our business in as we go forward as coaches, as a community. All those folks we talked about before, the history of coaching, bringing it all the way down to what do you do in your coaching world, but how do you connect with all of us who are doing this important work of coaching that's impacting the trillion-dollar businesses. So we're connected to this larger body of work. And so my suggestion is that in this new VUCA world of AI, that I think it would be well, and I made this up with the sand going up in the air, that we would see ourselves as a new multiple capacity coach. New multiple capacity coach. Well, what does that mean? And so here's one guy suggested this, and you can see his video, Andrew Nilich, that talked about for the Center of Executive Coaching. He talked about these phases of coaching. Now I put my word in here, fix my, that's Gary Charles's word here. But fix my employee, for those HR, one of my sisters in my small group that we were in, she's in HR. So fix my employee was a phase of coaching. Fix my life, there was the life coach phase in that. Fix my boredom, I don't have nothing to do, I just retired, so fix my boredom, I'll go do that. Fix my itch. You know, Zachary talked about those of you who have an itch. So all of us kind of come together with the itch. Fix my executive officer. That's going back to what we said about Steve Jobs, Bill Campbell, and Eric Schwartz, and all of that in organizations today. The next phase is what I think, fix my organization. And I think right now, while we're in, you know, L1, L2, L3, the new genre, the new certification is team coaching. And I think those of us who really want to stick on the cutting edge of moving with coaching, that we would do well to really think about showing up in the space, not just as an individual coach over the niches that we're working with, but also in this multiple capacity coach. And what I said, here's the mantra: become a hard-hitting, solution-based advisor who can help clients confront complex issues and walk alongside them as trusted advisors. Bill Gates was walked alongside of by Bill Campbell. Apple, Steve Jobs, every Sunday morning, the trillions of dollars, these guys made trillion-dollar decisions. And Bill Campbell was in that space with them. And I'm saying that some of these things down here, some of these capabilities, these skills that we normally wouldn't study, I think it would be helpful to hone in on some of these skills so that you can do some of this, particularly strategy planning. And just, maybe you won't be doing it, but at least understand it in terms of those kind of things. And my time is going out. I could say much more about that, but I'm just trying to say that. So here's some recommendations as a result of what I've shared today. Take the comprehensive ICF Marker training examination, those of you who are PCCs, because here's my observation. Those of us who trained maybe before 2020, those PCC markers are not that integrated into our coaching apparatus in terms of the technicalities of them. Philosophically, and in terms of the ontological parts of it, yes, we have it down because it was taught in our school and it's a part of the fabric and being of what we do as a skill. But we don't have them down functionally. And it would be well for us to do that, particularly as we mentor other coaches who have to engage this process. So we are to cultivate those skills to help them engage successfully ACC or PCC or MCC if we're a mentor coach. And if we don't have them down, we can't really hone the skills in them and notice them, except that maybe taking the marker training. And for some of you who need to renew your credentialing, This is an excellent way to do it for 40 core competency hours by taking that course at the ICC. I'm not sure how much it costs, but that's a great way to get that done and to do two things that would upgrade your PCC understanding of the markers and integrate them into your practice and who you are while you're getting 40 CCCs, and that gets you all the way through your certification. So it's cheaper than any other 40 hours you can find out there on the market. So that's just a hint from Garrett Charles. Recalibrate the integration of the PCC markers as a result of that. If you don't do it this way, in some way, find a way to do that. We'll be doing some work on that if you're interested in that kind of thing. And then upgrade your alignment with the ICF Code of Ethics. I talked about that a few minutes ago, drawing that down. And then take advantage of the ICF YouTube videos on the new PCC markers and the Code of Ethics. When you're out walking, exercising, or whatever, put it on and kind of integrate yourself in those. And that would be a way that I would advocate that you do that. So that's the end of what I want to share with you, because I'm talking about those of us becoming hard-hitting, solution-based advisors who can help our clients confront complex issues so that we can walk alongside of them as their trusted advisors. Some of this language betrays what we've learned about coaching. But I'm suggesting that we're in a transition. We're being called on, expected, and asked for new skills and abilities that are beyond maybe what we're conventionally used to providing. So with that in mind, I turn you back over to Zach, and we can entertain a few questions if there's time, but if not, we'll end for today. So let me stop there, and Zach is back on you.
Yeah, thank you, Gary, for your time and the discussion. So yeah, we can definitely open it up to questions and just a discussion on what was presented. So feel free to come off mute and share anything that came up for you or any questions.
Hey, Zach, it's Leslie. I missed, unfortunately, the course that was mentioned to take there at the end. Can you give me the name of that again?
Here it is right here. Take the comprehensive ICF PCC marker assessor training at the ICF. So you want to go to the education part of your education, look at the course offerings and find this course. It's a little hard to find, but I put it in here exactly like it's listed at the ICF, comprehensive ICF PCC marker assessor training. You must be a PCC in order to do it, but there it is.
Thank you so much.
Leslie, it's the cheapest way to get that 40 hours done for the cheapest price with the most CCs. You got way more than 24 than what you need, and you're good to go. And you might be able to do the ethics in there as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Gary. I enjoyed everything you had to say. It was so informational.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad it contributed. Amy, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Gary. I'm curious. I went from really being challenged and I dare I say hating the new assessment that was originally for ACC, PCC, and MCC, and helping people study for it. I started to fall in love with it. And I hate that that happened for me. I wish it was, I didn't like it and now I love it, but I really didn't really like it, but I love it now. And I was so surprised when the ICF decided to bring out one specifically for ACC, because I feel like it was such a good opportunity for even ACCs to truly understand the difference between the best and the worst answer. And I've been trying to, as I've been helping people with the new assessment, they're like, what happened with the old one kind of thing? Like, why was that too hard for us? And I'm just curious if you have any intel in terms of why they did the ACC specific one, because I feels a little bit more like a T-ball, sort of assessment that's lined up pretty easy versus the other assessment.
The grumbling in the education, for those of who sit in there, those of us, the grumbling that happened, Amy, was this. The experience level that the test was testing about was not the reality of most ACCs who are just getting into coaching. They just did not have the organizational background and exposure to those environments that the questions were being asked about. That was the biggest complaint.
Interesting.
Now, great questions. It wasn't the problem of the questions. I mean, and the complexity of the best answer, worst answer. That wasn't the basis of it. The basis of it is to say these young coaches that are just starting out, they have never worked in an organization as a coach before anyway. And so to ask them to ask those kind of sophisticated, as they were termed, questions was a bit unfair from their observation. And I think that was the driver.
It's so interesting because of things I complain about, you know, when the first time the new assessment came out and there was no bio break, if you're a woman over 50, that's not going to fly. So luckily, you know, the bio break was put in, but it's interesting, Gary, because I think what I coach people on when they take the now PCC, MCC assessment is that actually you don't have to actually read the question. Read the 4 options and talk to yourself about what aligns with ethics, what aligns with competencies, and sort of look at it that way. And so I hear you. There are people that have never sat in a boardroom, and yet I still think that, and again, I cannot believe I'm rooting for this assessment because I was not a fan of it, but I actually think it's a really incredible tool to actually teach ACCs. So maybe it's something where they use it as a teaching tool. Maybe it's not the assessment, but just, I really appreciate the insight though, Gary. Thank you.
I think they'll come back to it when they go for PCC. I think they'll have to take it. So,
They will.
Yeah,
they absolutely will.
So it's not like they're gonna get out of it. They'll come back and they'll have a chance to come up to bat. You know, it's like, okay, you're up to bat on the PCC test. And I anticipate, Amy, that they're probably going to do an MCC different one too. I think in the transition, my hunch is that's where they're going to go.
Thank you.
So we have about 1 minute. There's any last question?
If they're not, let me take this opportunity to just say to everybody, thank you for allowing me from the bottom of my heart to throw all this sand up. I hope it's been helpful. I wanted to give you a snapshot of history because I appreciate where we've been so much. And sometimes we don't take a look back over our shoulder to see how fortunate we are, just to take a glaze at what are the tributaries that put us where we are right now and how we are uniquely positioned. And so thank you for allowing me to share this. I had a good time. I had fun, and so I just appreciate it.
All right, thank you, Gary, and thank you everyone for your time today. We'll see you next time.